Hello and welcome to my Nutrient Nirvana channel. Today I'm joined once again, as you can see, by Mr. Ralph Ellis, author, researcher and scholar. And this is the first of a three-part series discussing the many names of Jesus. In today's episode, we're going to explore the historical record. So how are you, Ralph? Okay?
Very well, thanks, Paul. Thanks for having me back on again.
Great. Okay. So this topic would seem to be the main bone of contention with some of your detractors.
Yeah, strange, isn't it? I would have thought this would be one of the easiest things to understand, that the Jesus character may well have many pseudonyms. Um, Important people do have many pseudonyms. You've only got to look through, the history of monarchies to see that. Queen Elizabeth, if you wanted to take her titles as being names, has over 50 pseudonyms. Doesn't use them all that often, but she could refer to those as being her title, her name on occasions.
Yeah.
And the Jesus character also had many pseudonyms, and he had a doubly a good reason for doing so, because if my argument that he was the leader of the Jewish revolt is true, then his name was banned by Rome. You've only got to look at the history of the Jewish revolt to see that the leaders of the revolt are not highlighted very much within the story. And that's even true if you look on encyclopedias or the Wiki Encyclopedia and have a look there to see who were the leaders of the revolt. It's not clear by any means who the leaders of the revolt were. And yet, actually, we might go through this in more detail later, but it's quite obvious if you sort of read between the lines a little bit that the leaders of the revolt were the Edesna-Diabeni monarchy. Yet they have been largely deleted from that story because Rome didn't want you to know who these leaders were. They didn't want people venerating these these rebels against Rome. And so there was an amount of rewriting the texts in order to be Rome friendly, to delete these people from history. And Jesus was one of these guys who got deleted from history. And we know this is true because in the works of Josephus, if you do a computer search, it will go through the whole works of Josephus. And if you look for Edessa or the Edessan monarchy, it will just say, nothing found. And so if you were writing about the leader of the revolt, who I say was the biblical Jesus, if you were writing about him in that context, you could not use his name. It was taboo. It was forbidden. Rome had forbidden it. And the lackey of Rome, the chief author of these texts, Josephus Flavius, or Saul, as I say, from the biblical context, were under an obligation not to mention this person. Because it wasn't just taboo, it was probably a criminal offense. You would probably get burnt at the stake or crucified or whatever they wanted to do if you did mention this particular character. And so what they did is they invented a whole series of pseudonyms. And that's why you cannot overtly find this Jesus character within the historical record. You can't even find the Edessans overtly sometimes within the historical record. They go under pseudonyms. And one of those pseudonyms, I don't know which ones you want to go through first. Is any particular order to this?
Yes, I think if we tackle the historical record first, so we've got, I think it's 7 different characters in the historical record.
Yes, something like that. Yeah, we have from the Edessan Adiabeni context. I'm saying that Edessa was renamed as Adiabeni for these texts because they weren't allowed to use the name Edessa. They weren't allowed to glorify the name of Edessa, who were very central to this first century history of this region. And so they called Edessa Adiabene. And we have a good idea that that is so because the queen of Adiabene was also the queen of Edessa. And so we know there is a conflation there. And so when you look at the monarchy of Adiabene, they must also be linked or the same as Edessa. And the first of those, I suppose, is Monobazus, who was the king of Edessa. But of course, that's not even a name. You know, some of the critics will say, "Oh, yes, but you're using this name, Monobazus." Clearly, the Monobazus is not a name. It's a bastardized Greek title, meaning the only king. Monobazus in the Greek means the only king. And that was a title of the Adiabene kings. They were known as the only king, much the same as Jesus was also called the only king. He was called the only potentate, the only king. He had the same name. And so what I'm saying is that Monobazus was this King Jesus character. And that is a fairly rational conflation. And you get the same with the brother. Some of these Adiabenan kings, I think, had two names. I think they were called Izates Monobazus. So they weren't necessarily just brothers or father and son. I think they held both of these names. They were called Izates Monobazus. And Izates was, I think, again, another name for Jesus, because in the works of Josephus, who writes in the Greek, and he gives Izates a short name, which is Esus. And then we come onto the contention as to whether Jesus was called Joshua or Yeshua or not. I rather get the impression that he wasn't called Yeshua. Because the texts we have from Josephus are all in Greek, and the biblical texts we have are all in Greek. They're not in Aramaic or Hebrew, so we don't know how they spelt that particular name. So all we get is the Greek Eusus, and in this case the Parthian Esus, and nowadays the Persian Issa, which is their name for Jesus. Mm-hmm. And none of those are particularly compatible with the Hebrew Yeshua. So what I think has happened here is the name, well, in Adiabene Edessan terms, it is most certainly a sort of Parthian Persian name, Esus. And on having this name within this story, which came out of Judea, they were looking for an equivalent of that name, which would be Judaic, and they didn't necessarily have one. And so they said, oh, well, it's a corruption of, it's a Greek rendering of Yeshua. I don't think it is. It's a Greek rendering of the Parthian Esus, which became Eusus in the Greek. It sounds exactly the same. And that would have been his name. And so the combined title, this Edessan Adiabene king, would have been Esus Monobazus. You might even say Esus Manubazus, because the name of Jesus was Jesus Manuel. And of course, the title of the Edessan kings was Manu. In fact, this particular king was called Manu. So the king that lived in the AD 60s of Edessa Adiabene was called Manu, Esus Manu. And Jesus was called Izates Emmanuel. So these aren't even different names. People are complaining that I'm giving this guy different names. No, this is just a mistransliteration. This is a bastardization of his true name because you weren't allowed to actually mention his name. And so they've used a very poor corruption of his name. And so the Edessan king had exactly the same name as the biblical Jesus, which is one of the reasons I conflate the two.
Fantastic, Ralph. How about the Egyptian false prophet?
Yes, well, that one I would have thought was obvious. The Egyptian false prophet is mentioned in the Gospels and he's mentioned in the works of Josephus. And it's pretty obvious that this has to be the biblical Jesus. Again, this is not even a name. This is just a description because you weren't allowed to mention the name of this guy. So they've made this description of this person, which anyone in the know would have known referred to the biblical Jesus, because the Egyptian false prophet took the 5,000 out into the wilderness. Now, who took the 5,000 into the wilderness? Well, you know, that's pretty famous sort of event from the gospel story. And it was the Egyptian false prophet who organized an armed revolt on the Mount of Olives that was interrupted by the Roman guard. And of course, again, that's a very famous event within the gospel story. So it's pretty obvious that at the very least, the Egyptian false prophet can be linked with the biblical Jesus. But since you couldn't mention his name in that context, then it's pretty obvious to me that this was actually the biblical Jesus, because Josephus never mentions the biblical Jesus. You know, the Testimonium Flavium is a complete fiction, of course. Is an interpolation by a later scholar of the likes of Eusebius into the works of Josephus, even though some of my critics don't believe that. But I think it's widely known within scholarly circles that that is an interpolation. It's a later addition into the works of Josephus. And so Josephus never mentions the biblical Jesus. And that's a problem because Josephus knew all of the events of the first century up until the AD 80s, maybe even almost approaching the AD 90s. He knew everything that was happening in Judea, and he never mentions the biblical Jesus. But of course, if someone like the Egyptian false prophet was the biblical Jesus, then of course he is mentioning him. He's just mentioning him in code. And that's what's going on here. So why anyone would want to oppose that idea, I don't know. I mean, it's just so obvious that the Egyptian false prophet was the biblical Jesus. That's why Jesus was pointedly said to have come out of Egypt. Out of Egypt I have called my son. He went to Egypt for his education. That's why he was known as the Egyptian false prophet. Because he came from Egypt, he was a prophet, and they didn't believe him, so he was false. He was the Egyptian false prophet. It's obvious.
Yeah, brilliant. Then we move on to Jesus of Gamala of Tiberius and Jesus Flavius of Tiberius as well.
Yeah, the two Jesuses from the AD 60s again. This is another section. Is linked to the King Asa story of him coming into Syria from Babylon. But we have these different names that are more familiar to us. Again, if you read the Penguin Classics, and I'm surprised at the Penguin Classics doing this, if you read the Penguin Classics of Josephus' works, they call him Joshua, Yeshua. I deliberately, I think, just to confuse people, because that is, i.e., not to mention the name Jesus with regard to these two characters. Because
and it's the same on, sorry, Ralph, but it's the same on Wikipedia as well, isn't it?
Oh,
I
is
think
it?
we've got Joshua ben Gamala, if I remember rightly.
Yeah. It's done deliberately to confuse you, so you don't know that this has anything to do with the biblical Jesus.
Yeah.
The works of Josephus that we have were written in Greek. We don't have the original. The originals were in Hebrew, Aramaic, but we don't have those, so we don't know what they said. All we have is the Greek ones, and this character in the Greek is called Jesus again. Jesus. He's not called Joshua. So that's a misinterpretation for a start. So we get these two characters called Jesus in the AD 60s. And of course, people will separate that off from the gospel era because they don't know anything about the chronological chasm, that the gospel story took place in the AD 60s, not the AD 30s. So that's a problem to start with. So people cannot see this as being the biblical Jesus. But if you just accept for the minute that Jesus was an AD 60s character, we have a linkage to these two Jesuses within the works of Josephus, who were rebels during the AD 60s at the beginning of the Jewish revolt. And they are rather similar. And the question is, are they the same Jesus, for a start? And then are they the biblical Jesus, for a second? Well, the difference between these two Jesuses is that they are in separate portions of the works of Josephus. So this mostly comes from the work called Vita, or Life, which is a biography of Josephus Flavius and his wonderful deeds as the army commander in Judea in the AD 60s, late AD 60s. And he is fighting these two characters, both called Jesus, Jesus of Gamala, Jesus Sapphias. But the sections that deal with these two characters are in different portions. So we get Jesus of Gamala first, and then we get Jesus Sapphias second, as if they're almost written by a different chronicler. Because I don't think Josephus wrote all of his text. I think he employed a lot of people to do it. So he had scribes writing this, and they've just used different names. But in the similarities, both of these characters were governors of Tiberius in the AD 60s. So they were fairly important people, governors of Tiberius, and one of them especially is said to have owned a castle in Galilee. So again, fairly rich, fairly wealthy, fairly influential. And Jesus Sapphias was said to be the leader of a seditious mob of 600. Now, who was the leader of fishermen in the first century? We don't have to look far to see the guise of the biblical Jesus behind this. And then a question came up, because some of my critics, as you were saying, said you can't conflate these two Jesuses. They're different people. They're not the same. And they also said they were, well, how was this put? They were allies of Josephus Flavius. And I don't know where on earth they get that from, because it's said of these Jesuses, and again, this is very similar between the two. It's said of Jesus of Gamala that Simon, he was a high priest in Jerusalem, persuaded the high priests Ananias and Jesus, the son of Gamala, and some others of the same seditious faction to cut me down, to cut Josephus down, because he was growing so great and aggrandizing myself to the height of glory. So the Josephus Flavius, as the army commander in command of Galilee, overstepping the mark and using his authority far too much, aggrandizing himself to the height of glory. And the Jerusalem priesthood paid Jesus, the son of Gamala, to cut him down. That's not an ally. That's not a friend. So I don't see where they get this idea from. So these people were contending against each other, this Jesus and Josephus, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It's the same sort of idea. And then they said again about the same chap and the same intent for cutting down Josephus. They said, when they heard that a certain Galilean in Jerusalem, whose name was Jesus, who had about him a band of 600 armed men, they sent for him and gave him 3 months' pay to kill or capture Josephus Flavius. Again, these people were not allies. They were being used by the Jerusalem priesthood to try and capture or kill Josephus Flavius. They were enemies. And when you go on to Jesuses of Tiberius, they say exactly the same thing. So this is in a later portion of the same book, and it says, Jesus, the son of Tiberius, one of those whom we've already mentioned as the leader of a seditious tumult of fishermen and poor people. Again, both of these characters were seditious leaders of armed mobs, and in this case, a seditious tumult of fishermen. When does the local dockside, take up arms and start, marching on Jerusalem? They're not talking about fishermen, of course. They're talking about a religious faction to do with the great month of Pisces. This is all to do with astrology. Anyway, this seditious tumult of fishermen and poor people prevented us and took with him certain Galileans and set the whole place on fire. This was a dispute about heretical images of animals in Tiberius. This was a mention of the mosaic at Hamat Tavera on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, which has heretical images of animals in it. And then it goes on, it says, it was this Jesus, the son of Tiberius, who principally urged them on. He was the governor of Tiberius. Yeah, they were both the governor of Tiberius. A wicked man and naturally disposed to make disturbances in matters of consequence. A seditious person he was indeed, an innovator beyond anybody else. So both of these characters are extremely similar. They're both the governors of Tiberius. They're both fighting against Josephus Flavius, who was the army commander in command of Galilee. And they're both sort of being paid by the Jerusalem priesthood to try and cut him down. It's fairly obvious that Jesus of Gamala and Jesus of Tiberius are the same person, and they are contending with Josephus Flavius in Galilee, just as the biblical Jesus was contending with the biblical Saul in Galilee, which is why I link the two of them, because it's never mentioned why or how Saul was not only contending with Jesus, but as he says, he was wreaking havoc and killing and putting in jail the Nazarene Jews in Galilee. How was Saul doing that? Under what authority was Saul doing that? I mean, he was just a pauper. He was just a tent maker. You got random tent makers walking around Galilee, throwing people into prison who he doesn't like. Under what authority was he doing that? Well, as Josephus Flavius, we know exactly how he was doing that, because he was the army commander in command of Galilee, and he had been instructed by the Jerusalem priesthood, who were actually paying him a lot of silver, to go and capture Josephus Flavius. And that's why he had this big contention between Josephus Flavius and these two, or the conflated Jesus guy, in Galilee. And it's a bit like Keystone Cops. They're all literally, they're capturing each other and then releasing each other because they're being paid a ransom and all of this sort of business. It's real Keystone Cop stuff. It really is. It's quite an interesting story, Josephus was on his own with only 2 or 3 guards, and there was the army of Jesus was outside, so he invited someone in to parley. And so he cut off his hands and wrapped them around his neck and sent him back outside again to show, or to try and show, that Josephus had a big army inside this castle, which he didn't have. And so it's all bluff and counter bluff and things like that. I mean, yeah, this Saul Josephus guy was not necessarily very nice. You know, he's cutting off people's hands and wrapping them around his neck, and then getting another guy. He captured an ambassador of the Jesus character and then got him drunk so that he could find out what they were planning. It's real Keystone Cop stuff. Yeah. It really is.
Wow.
Anyway, it's all very fun.
Yeah, definitely. Just one thing I'd like you to clear up if possible, because I looked into the Jesus of Gamala character. We're told that he was a high priest of Jerusalem in the AD 60s, but Wiki gives us a death date for AD 56, 57, I believe.
Yes.
So this is somewhat confusing.
Yes, I don't know how they've managed to get that. The trouble is with, with Wiki, of course, anyone can edit it. So anyone can put in these. I'll have to have a look at that and see if I can re-edit that. Josephus has a habit of saying, these rebels did this, and they had an uprising, and the uprising was put down and they were killed. And that's his standard way of ending a particular topic. They were killed. They were crucified. And I don't think it's necessarily true. I just think that's a way of ending that particular topic. The guy probably just ran away or was in prison for a while or whatever, and the story continues. But we know that this Jesus of Gamala guy was alive in the AD 60s because he married Mary Magdalene. That's a problem for the classical story. This comes from Robert Eisenman, who wrote 200 pages or more on how Jesus of Gamala married Monobazus, which comes from the Talmud, but that Monobazus just has to be Mary of Bethany. Well, in fact, he married both of them. He married Mary and Martha of Simon Boethus. And of course, the Bethany sisters lived at the house of Simon. Again, it's one of these stories that all links up and makes sense if you know what it's talking about. Although Robert Eisenman himself cannot believe the results of his analysis, because in the end he says, no, they can't be the same, because the Mary Boethus lived far too late. Because the Mary Magdalene story is supposed to be AD 20s. The Mary Boethus story is AD 60s. We have this 40-year chronological chasm again. And because of this chasm, he cannot link physically Mary Magdalene and Mary Boethus. And so what he says is, they based the story of Mary Magdalene upon Mary Boethus. And so she's fictional, and they made up this story based on this other character. No, Mary Magdalene lived in the AD 60s, and she did indeed marry Jesus of Gamala, because the Talmud says so. And as we've been through this before, but she was the richest woman in Judea. She had a dowry of 1 million gold denarii when she got married to Jesus of Gamala, and he became high priest. In fact, he didn't just become high priest. Mary Magdalene bought him the high priesthood for a takab of silver, which is quite a lot. I worked it out as about 70 kilos of silver for her husband to become the high priest. And we have this record of Jesus of Gamala becoming high priest in AD 65, which again is far too late for the classical biblical Jesus story. But if you factor in the chronological chasm, it works perfectly. And that's the beauty of these explanations, is why in isolation, each one of these stories is a possibility, but there's not that much evidence to actually say definitively whether it's true or not. But if you put them all together, they all align up and fit. All the pieces of the jigsaw fit perfectly. You're going to line up 10, 20, 30 of these separate incidences, and they all line up and work perfectly in the AD 60s, then I think we can say that this is probably true. This is probably correct.
Brilliant. Okay. Ralph, I love this one. Tell us about the crucified man in the works of Josephus.
Yes, my critics don't like me conflating Jesus with the crucified man. Again, they keep saying, oh, there's far too many conflations, different characters. Well, yes, as we've said before, Jesus could not be named, and that's why Josephus does not name this person. You always have to be suspicious of Josephus when he says a certain person. Yeah, thanks, Josephus. It's quite clear you know who this person was. So why don't you tell us who this guy was? And that's what we get with this crucifixion story. A certain person, the leaders of the revolt, who were my compatriots, but I'm not going to tell you who they are. Anyway, Josephus was coming back from Tekoa because he was a Roman army commander by now. This is just after the Jewish revolt. And he's leading a detachment of Roman soldiers coming back from Tekoa. He comes into Jerusalem and he sees 3 of his former compatriots being crucified in the Kidron Valley. He's aghast at this because he thinks it's a stupid idea. It's much better to have hostages that are alive rather than dead. So he goes to the governor and he says, I want to take these guys down. He's given permission. They're taken down early from the cross. 2 of them die and 1 of them survives. It's the biblical Passion of Jesus. I mean, it's exactly the same. 3 people being crucified who were known by the person who took them down, who went to the governor to take them down early. They were taken down early, which is against sort of Roman practice to take them down early. And 1 of them survives or resurrects, if you like it in the biblical story. It's the Passion of Jesus, but that's a problem. And you can see why their names have been covered up. I mean, Josephus had to cover them up because Rome was saying, you got to cover these, you're not allowed to mention these people. But Christianity has to cover them up as well, because a Christian could look at this and say, well, this is proof that Jesus existed. We have the evidence. Josephus is telling us, here's the crucifixion story. But they can't do that because it goes against the classical narrative in a big way. It's very controversial. So what it means, if you take this to be the biblical crucifixion, it means that the crucified person was a leader of the Jewish revolt. So he wasn't a pauper prince of peace in sandals, with a cloak and a staff. He was a leader of the revolt, the Jewish revolt against Rome. That's a problem for classical Christianity. It also means that this crucifixion scene happened in AD 70, 40 years after the classical crucifixion of Jesus. That's a problem. And it means that, and I don't like to be conflating too many people again because, people get so upset by this, but it means that Joseph of Arimathea must be Josephus Flavius, because they both took this Jesus character down from the cross. And no self-respecting Christian would want Josephus Flavius to be a primary hero of their religion. I mean, he's just such a slippery, horrible, narcissistic, egotistical character, a traitorous character. You would never want him to be the primary disciple of your new religion. And so it had to be covered up. And so they called him Josephus of Arimathea. But of course, we get a clue there as well, because he becomes Joseph Matthias. And of course, the brother of Josephus Flavius was called Matthias, and the father was as well. So he was Joseph ben Matthias. So pretty much they have the same name. And this explains why this white knight guy comes marching out at the end of the story. A bit like Richard I within the story of Robin Hood. He just appears, from nowhere at the end of the story. Joseph of Arimathea does exactly the same. And he appears in the story as if everyone must know who this guy is. He doesn't need explanation. You know who this character is, but this character comes in and takes Jesus down from the cross. Yeah, but we don't know who this person is. But of course, in that era, everyone would have known it was Josephus Flavius, but you weren't allowed to mention that. And so over the years, that knowledge has drifted away, and all we get is this curious character that comes in at the last minute and takes the Jesus character down from the cross and allows him, as it were, to survive, to resurrect. It's the same story, but it only works in the AD 70s, not the AD 30s.
Thanks, Ralph. And the very last character from the historical record that we've got is Jesus of Ananias.
Jesus Ananias, yes. I don't make a great deal of this because not much is said about this character. If I remember correctly, he's a priest, but not a high priest. Anyway, the story of Jesus Ananias comes from the Jewish revolt era again, and he laments the fate of Jerusalem in exactly the same way that the biblical Jesus does. So it's not much of a conflation, this, because we don't have much information about this guy, but we have this guy lamenting about the fate of the fate of Jerusalem in exactly the same fashion of Jesus. And then in a typical fashion, Josephus says, and he died. Well, yeah, Josephus always says that. And critics will say, oh, it can't be your biblical Jesus or the same as Jesus of Gamala because it said he died. Well, yes, but that's just the way Josephus just ends each story, We had this guy, he was being a real pain, lamenting the fate of Jerusalem, and then he died. But I don't think that's really what happened. But we do have a number of Jesus characters from the works of Josephus. And this is why people say, oh, Jesus was a popular name in this era, because they keep finding all of these Jesuses. Well, maybe not if the name for Eusus in the Greek comes from the Parthian Esus, and if all of these guys can be conflated into the biblical Jesus, well, then it wasn't necessarily quite such a popular name. Most of these characters are, in fact, references to the biblical Jesus. And remember, all of these references are in separate parts of the works of Josephus. They're not mentioned together. It's the character that's always missing from the story is the other Jesus.
One of the things I love about your work and research, Ralph, is it just makes complete sense of everything. It really does. It ties everything up. I know a lot of my viewers think that as well. So
yeah, nice little bow.
And just before we close, can I congratulate you on your recent performance on the debate with Dr. Robert M. Price? If my viewers haven't seen it, I'll link it underneath this video. It was a brilliant debate. I thought you were excellent, and I really loved Price's response to your information. I was listening to. I was listening to you, but I was watching Price's face because it was priceless. If you pardon the pun. And it was lovely to see as well, because he's obviously a very well venerated scholar. And at times I think he was absolutely flabbergasted by your knowledge on this subject. And it was nice to see his response, because obviously, as you've said yourself, you've had many detractors since you've been writing about the historical Jesus, and it was just fantastic to see.
Yeah, it was slightly daunting because obviously Robert Price is a very good scholar. He knows his stuff. And so if you're going up against a good scholar, it's always a risk that you might get tied into a knot somewhere because he might know some aspects of the story that you're not familiar with. So it's very difficult going up against, well, not against, because we weren't competing against each other, but having a discussion with a very erudite scholar. But as it happens, I had aspects as well that Price hadn't heard about. Quite obviously, as you said from his expressions. So I was giving data that he had not heard before. And that was good because then, I've elevated myself, as it were, in his estimations, that I can come out with some interesting information. And yes, that calmed the situation down because I think Jacob Berman, who organized this, was trying to make a confrontation out of this. I think that was his goal, was to make a confrontation, because he doesn't particularly like me very much. And he looked a little bit upset that he couldn't make a confrontation. I had diffused the situation from almost the first couple of questions. And from then on, it ran fairly nice and smoothly. It was quite nice. It was a nice discussion. So yeah, again, like yourself, I would recommend viewers go and have a look at it because it's quite a good video.
Yeah, I'll link that underneath this video. Thanks, Ralph, and thanks everyone for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe, and look out for part 2 in this mini-series where we'll be discussing the many names of Jesus in the Talmud. Cheers, Ralph.
Thanks, Bob.
Thanks.